I'd like to take a quick moment to look at the differences between the child brain and the adult brain. We're constantly amazed by the brain. It's this amazing thing. It does these wonderful things. But I'd like us to just spare a thought for the very long path that it's had to travel from an evolutionary perspective. The brain, we know, is not really this sleekly designed wonderful thing that gets better each time we evolved. It's in some ways a little bit more like an ice cream cone. So each time the brain develops and we learn to do something new, it's like a new scoop that gets placed onto the already existing scoops. And your brain basically functions so that the oldest parts of the brain, and those are the most important for survival, are at the back of the skull. So the brain functions that control things like breathing and consciousness, those are at the back of your head where the skull is really nice and thick. And that has a protective factor so that it's the least likely place for your brain to get hurt if you were to fall or to get a blow to the head. Then from there, the more sophisticated functions start happening towards the front. So the skills or the aspects important for survival, then we get those aspects that help us perceive. So towards the front of the brain, we get things like visual perception, auditory perception, then language skills, and right at the front, in the frontal lobes of the brain, we have those things that we call executive functions. And those would be things like planning skills, being able to wait, inhibiting our impulses, and understanding social rules, interpreting people's social skills. Now, we know that the frontal lobe is one of the last areas of the brain to develop, and it develops throughout childhood and pretty much into early adulthood. And that's why little ones, and sometimes even teenagers, battle to recognize the rules of behavior. They might not always know what exactly is acceptable in a social situation. And they battle a little bit to control their impulses and to reason through a task. It's absolutely vital that they practice these skills, though, because even though they might not be able to do it, it's not something that's just going to happen one day. So we need to practice those skills throughout childhood and as they get older so that we build the neural pathways that will enable them to do that when they're adults. New research has shown that the child's brain regions that generally when a baby is born, the areas of the brain that fire together are those that are located closely together. So it's more about proximity. But as the brain becomes better at doing tasks, it becomes more effective. We know that what it needs to do is perhaps sometimes have different parts of the brain that might be further away work together in order to get a task done. So as the brain grows and those neural pathways grow, it becomes more about functionality and which parts of the brain work together rather than which parts of the brain work or closely situated to each other. Very interestingly is that before we knew about all of this, before we had any idea into brain research, there already was a 20th century psychologist named Jean Piaget who picked up on all of this. He realized that the way that children reason is just totally different to the way that adults reason. And his insights are still so incredibly valuable today that we still use them in all our child education and child development work. I'd like to go through some of these very important insights with you. And one of the things that Piaget picked up with little infants and toddlers is that they don't have an idea of object permanence. So essentially, your child doesn't necessarily understand that an object continues to exist when he can't see it. And that plays a role, of course, later on in that separation anxiety, when your child cries uncontrollably when you leave a room and you're actually just in the room next to it. So here, the value of educational games like peekaboo and hide and go seek, or just hiding the bottle underneath the pillow or underneath the blanket becomes so important because we're teaching our children that things continue to exist even if you can't see them. Piaget's second really interesting insight is that children are essentially entirely egotistical. They battle to understand something from another person's perspective. they can't really understand what you are thinking or why you would be feeling or thinking that way. And so often we find that when you listen to a little one telling a story, they might not give you much background, and you might battle to understand exactly what it is they're trying to tell you. But that's because they assume that you already have the knowledge that they have. They assume that you understand what they have, and they can just tell you the story from there. And we know that as the frontal lobe continues to develop, they start realizing that people might think differently and understand things differently to the way that they do. And they become a little bit better at understanding social rules and how to get people on the same page as they are. They also battle to understand constancy. So if I were to take a piece of Play-Doh and divide it into two equal parts, roll the one little bit up into a small tiny ball, and take the other and flatten it out into a big broad pancake and offer both to a child, the chances are that they're probably going to take the big flat pancake because it looks better. They don't necessarily understand that both of those are exactly the same amount, it's just the shape that's changed. And initially, children can also be very rigid in their thinking. If they find a solution to a problem that works, they'll often stick to that solution quite a few times. They can't always understand that there might be different ways to solve a problem. Only as they grow and they refine that executive functioning will they begin to understand that there are so many ways to get to the same solution. And understanding how children work and function is so incredibly important to help us to relate to them, to understand how it is that they see the world and to work with them from there. And all of these things will help make our experiences with them so much more relevant. And that essentially is how to help them to benefit optimally from any interaction.